All right, welcome back, my friends, to All Cars Reacts. This week, we are doing the 87 Volkswagen Fox. Now, about 4 years ago, not quite, I actually did a reaction to a two-door Fox station wagon on the main channel. I have not and am not going to migrate that video over here to this channel because it's so old and so bad. But if you recall, I did have a Fox, and I'm a big fan of this car. I have such fond memories of it, and it changed my opinion of imports. It changed my opinion of Volkswagen. I had a great experience with them. I'll share it at the end. And I felt like it was time to do it again just to reminisce. So, as always, make yourself comfortable. Sit back in that comfy chair, grab yourself a beverage of choice. This is some coffee because it's relatively early in the morning here. And then I want you to firmly put on some rose-colored glasses to go back to 1987 and look at a car that was arguably out of date before it was ever released. Let's take a look at it today, guys.
Well, all of our road test subjects, including this VW Fox, are built in developing countries where the labor rate is low. The Festiva and the Le Mans are both built in Korea, but there are other countries with the same low labor rate advantage. Brazil, for example. And as it happens, Volkswagen has a facility there, a sort of little Wolfsburg, where it builds cars for the markets of South America. Well, one model called the Voyage was also found to be just right for the North American bargain car market. So VW spiffed it up, renamed it the Fox, and now it's here. The first inexpensive VW since the Beetle. But does the Fox have the charm that made the Beetle so popular?
So that was a little overly short. And, you know, admittedly, the history of the Fox is super convoluted, actually. And I've only just recently begun to understand some of the ins and outs of this. And it's really frustrating to me. I've always thought, I'd always heard, and I've always said the Fox, they took an old Audi platform, made it a Volkswagen, built it in Brazil, sold it in America. Broadly speaking, that's correct, but not exactly. See, what I understand, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I got some facts wrong here, but NSU, auto manufacturer, way back in the day, they owned the Fox name, and I think that was for a motorcycle. Well, NSU was one of the companies that came together to form Auto Union, Audi. So Audi had the Fox name, and Audi is part of Volkswagen. So Audi had, or Volkswagen Group had, the BX platform. Basically the old Audi 80. Brazil has its own manufacturing and its own engineering capabilities. And they took the BX platform and they made it something for their market. And that's what became the Volkswagen Voyage. But the Voyage is a name for the Volkswagen Gol, G-O-L, not golf, Gol. And there's a whole nother name for the station wagon version. So they mixed up all these names. And what's even more frustrating is Argentina also had a factory. And when they built it, they used different names if it came from that factory. But at some point, you have an old Audi's platform that Brazil started with. I don't know how much they changed it, what percentage changed, but they modified it and started manufacturing it. And eventually Volkswagen said, let's bring that up to America as our cheapest car. And another little tidbit, I thought this was interesting. This car was originally designed in like 1980, I believe, to use a 1.3 liter air-cooled engine at the front from the Beetle. And then like a year or a year and a half later, something like that, they put in a water-cooled engine. And eventually they upgraded it until they got to the 1.8 liter engine, which is what I had, from the Passat, their much, much bigger car. It's a fascinating history to me. I have done a video which is a reflection on my ownership of this car because I had such a positive opinion of it. I think it actually deserves its own history video with all those little tidbits. I just don't know if anybody wants to watch that. But let's move on.
Not if you're judging the Brazilian VW Fox by its quantum on a hunger strike looks. It's not that the car is homely, it's just not terribly unique. But the Fox has some other charming qualities. Take its price. $5,690 for the base two-door Fox, $6,490 for the GL four-door, and $7,790 for our air-conditioned, stereo-equipped GL test car.
Okay, let's talk about styling, and I'll touch on price as well. I have mixed feelings about this. You could say this is homely. I would say it's minimalist. And the fact is I love this. And part of the reason is it's got a pretty flat front, flat grille, rectangular headlights. Much like the K cars, much like, I don't know, the Omni and the Horizon. You know, I like that look. It's when they start to, when manufacturers start to stretch it and pull it and try to stylize it a little bit more, like was it the Dodge 600, I think, where they actually pulled the bumper out and did some other, it starts to look fake to me. This looks minimalist and purposeful. Like, we need to make a small car and we need to make the trunk and the passenger space as big as possible, and this is what we got. Now, they did use a longitudinal engine here, so it's not as space efficient as what you would have gotten from some of the, say, Japanese cars. But I like the look and I like the proportions. And I mean, I liked it enough to buy one, and it was a great car. The problem is, for 1987, and this thing lasted until, I want to say, 1993, it got left behind pretty quickly. It looks, for all the world, like a 5-year-old Audi design, because it almost was. I love it. That expresses me in a lot of ways. But if you look at that and you're like, oh, I'd much rather have a Civic, believe me, I understand. And the price, oh my gosh. Oh, Volkswagen. And do not go do an inflation calculator on me, okay? I get it. And this is probably more expensive, almost certainly more expensive than Honda, Toyota, Nissan offerings at the time. Or this is meant to really compete with like the Hyundai Excel or the Yugo that was coming out in 86, I think. I get it. Inflation. But for $7,000, I would buy one of these today. I would drive to the VW dealer and pay cash for one of these to drive it for the next 10 years. Absolutely, 100%.
Not only is the price right, but the Fox GL has a lot of standard features, including a remote control right side mirror, rear window defogger, intermittent wipers, and tachometer. The door panels and the seats are covered in an attractive cloth, not vinyl, and offer adequate all-round support for most drivers. On the dash, things look like they do in other Volkswagens, but the pod-mounted flip switches are flimsy, and it's hard to read their markings. They face the doors, not the driver. We also think there are too many different textures and colors of plastic on the dash, but dash storage is good, and there are deep door pockets. And the gauges, as on every German Volkswagen, are sensible white on black. The four-door has a tachometer, small fuel and water temperature readouts, plus a digital clock. All other controls are within easy reach. The heat switches are very straightforward, but old-fashioned. You have to close off dash vents to get full air to the defroster or floor. The only other problem is a radio position that leaves the station readout out of driver's sight. At the rear, the doorways are narrow, but there's plenty of room for 2 adults. Those 6-footers will find headroom just adequate. There are standard shoulder belts. The Fox is...
Okay, before they move on, let's talk about the interior for a minute. I can't disagree with a word they just said. The gauges were clear. But I remember they just had lights. And I remember opening the owner's manual to be like, what the heck did the lights mean? Right? And the mix of materials, I didn't really register at the time when I had it, but looking back, yeah. Obviously, one manufacturer made one part of the dash and another manufacturer made another part. those switches on each side of the gauge cluster. I hate those. I hated them then. I hate them now. I hate them in other cars. They worked though, but they were the cheapest. They were literally Lego quality plastic. Worse than that, actually. Worse than that. But they did work. And you could see while they were playing with it, it actually would rock back and forth. They looked like they were going to break at every moment. They felt click like they were going to break, but they never did. They continued to work. The rest of the stuff, I agree with them on as well. The HVAC, you know what? You press a big button, you move a slider, it worked. But it wasn't, the ergonomics wasn't where the industry was going. The radio was low. You had to look down to see it. And it all reinforces a old design built in essentially an emerging market, right? Built to a price point. But it does not change the fact that once you were driving it, it felt better than most other cars out there. And I would like to talk about the seats real quick. I came from a Buick Regal, right? So I had a 76 Buick Regal, big, two-door, comfortable. And my third car was an 83 Buick Regal, troublesome but comfortable, pillowy seats. A great cruiser on the interstate. And then I got this. And I got one of these in a station wagon because I needed a space to put all my stuff to move back and forth to college. These seats, the strongest thing I can say about them, and I don't mean this as faint praise, I never thought about them. I came from a Buick Regal with pillow seats, and I sat in these, and I never thought about them. Wherever I drove around the southeast or the nation, I never had to think about the seats. They were firm, they were sculpted, they were not Buick seats, but I never thought about them. And that tells me they were just about perfect. And I'm not going to gloss over too much here. Interior was cheap, and yeah, there was a lot better out there, and all of it was from the Japanese. This car had a couple of fatal flaws. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Trunk looks small and ill-shaped, but except for a high sill, it swallowed our test luggage without a fuss. Unfortunately, there's no folding rear seat to let you expand the luggage area. For those who need to tote things, a two-door GL wagon version of the Fox should be out later this summer, and its rear seat does fold. But the Fox has some other ways of making up for its shortcomings. It has the largest engine in its class, the same 1.8-liter four-cylinder that goes in Golfs and Jettas. It turns out 81 horsepower and 91 pound-feet of torque. Since it's mounted in the north-south position, there's plenty of room for maintenance. The Fox also has a 2-year unlimited mileage warranty that covers everything but tires. And the Fox will rack up miles and quarter miles at a pretty brisk pace. 18.1 seconds for our car, and with a finishing speed of 75. Not bad. 0 to 60 takes only 11.1 seconds. The Fox gets a 4-speed manual transmission. There's no automatic, but a 5-speed is planned. Fourth here is an overdrive gear, and the shifter action is very short and smooth. There's a long gap between the first and second gear ratios, but the engine has enough power to overcome it in all but standing starts from the steepest hills. On twisty roads, the Fox is very much at home. The non-power assisted steering is crisp and relatively quick. Front-end plow is moderate. The funny thing is, the Fox doesn't look like it handles well. There's a lot of body roll, and the Fox takes to a slalom pylon like a dog to a fire hydrant, a Volkswagen habit. The car isn't the least bit embarrassed by this indiscretion, though, and it won't embarrass its driver either. From behind the wheel, you barely feel the car's antics, and the rear end obediently trails the front, even if only on one wheel.
Okay, let's talk about all that for a minute. I have respect for that engine. And almost everything I say about this car, I'm tempered by the knowledge that the Corolla and the Civic exist out there. I think this is targeted under those. I really do. If you compare this to a Tercel, this is a better car. If you compare it to where the Civic was going by the time this was canceled, this is out of date. This is 10 years out of date. But of all the cars I've owned, I have had a Mazda Protege that I never should have sold. I loved that car so much. I have a few other things I wish I'd held on to. But let me tell you, those late Friday nights when maybe there's some adult beverages consumed and I get on Auto Trader, it's a used Fox that I look for. I mean, yeah, other people are out there looking for Ferraris and Maseratis and Alfa Romeos, and I look at those too. But you know what? Deep down, this car made an impression, and not because it was better at everything. Do I think a Civic is a better car? Yes, I do. But this car made an impression. That engine, was it the most powerful? Of course not. 81 horsepower? You know what? The Saturn, when it was released, only made like 84, 85. This engine was competitive with fuel injection. That big gap in between first and second gear? Yeah, but you know what? That low first gear got you moving when you were in traffic. It only had a 4-speed, but it was an overdrive 4-speed. So guess what? No lie, I am not joking here, and I was in engineering school at the time, so I tracked this. My station wagon did not have air conditioning. It had air conditioning. It had broken, and I never fixed it because it cost money. This was a 4-speed at the interstate, speeds. If I was real consistent with it, I could get close to 50 miles per gallon in this car. And that is no lie and no exaggeration. With a 4-speed. Now, they did come out with the 5-speed eventually. And that handling, it looks ridiculous. It looks like if this was a Korean manufacturer, if this was almost anybody else, that would be a tragic mistake. But because it was a Volkswagen, it just kept tracking. It actually rode pretty well on the interstate as well. And it would travel at, I've heard, triple digits for hours. This car changed my opinion of what a car should feel like. When you come from a 76 Buick to a Jeep CJ5 to an 83 Buick to this thing, it was light, it was fuel efficient, it was kind of zoomy and rock solid at speed. And it did handle well. It never handled sporty, okay? But if you drove this and then you drove like an Escort, they were in different universes from each other, in my opinion. Ridiculous looking results. Big fan of how it actually drove.
But all 4 wheels stay on the ground under braking, and the Fox does an excellent job of it. Our car's average distance in 6 stops was a short 110 feet. It stops straight every time with a good solid feel from the brake pedal. Overall, solid feel is one of the things that characterizes the Fox. At speed, it gives you the same gyroscopic stability you find in more expensive German cars. It's also fairly quiet, generating 69 decibels at 55. But at the same time, the Fox is a great car for the city. It has a tiny 32-foot turning circle and good fuel economy. It's EPA rated at 26 city, 30 highway. We manage 32 and 100 miles of average driving. But it's price that tops our list of hits, along with the Fox's wealth of standard features. We are also impressed by the car's power and its brakes. Best of all, the Fox inspires confidence on the highway with its big car feel and stability. But it misses the mark with no fold-down rear seat for the 2- and 4-door sedans. We also dislike the mishmash of plastics used on the dash and the way they were assembled. In our safety check, the Fox passes with standard radial tires, halogen headlamps, 5-mile-per-hour bumpers, and rear shoulder belts. But those are only on the 4-door GL. All models fail to have front passive restraints. A short time back, we picked the Fox as best bargain car in our annual Driver's Choice Awards. After reviewing the Fox again and its new competitors, we'd make the same choice today, thanks to the Fox's combination of small and big car virtues, and thanks to its bargain price. So while it lacks the fresh styling of some competitors, and it's not as charming as the Beetle, it's exactly what it should be, an inexpensive, practical, solid Volkswagen. And that's enough for the Fox to generate a cult following all its own.
Interesting end, how they wrap that up. I don't remember this car ever being really successful. They offered a bunch of different trim lines like GL, GLS. They ended up with Wolfsburg editions. They had the 4-door. They ended up with a 2-door and a 2-door wagon, which is what I had. And they sold it for, I think, 6 years. I'd have to check that. I think it was 87 to 93. And I don't remember, honestly, until I bought one, I don't remember ever actually seeing one. I don't think they sold terribly well. And I think that was a great, great shame. They needed something cheaper to compete with, again, the Hyundai Excel or the Yugo that were out there, something to capture buyers into Volkswagen. And I think it was just, while I loved it and I appreciate it, I think it was the wrong car at the wrong time. That in 87, I think this car looked okay. It looked a little like the Audis that had come before, and I think it was as stylish as some of the Toyotas and the Nissans that had been out there. But things like the Civic looked much smoother and sleeker and had a smaller nose because of that transverse engine. They didn't say anything about where the price stacked up against its competitors. It was more expensive than, say, the Yugo or the Excel. I think wasn't the Excel like $5,900. The Yugo was $39,990, something like that. So this, with air conditioning, was a little bit more expensive. And it just, it ended up looking old really quick. So I think a few things killed it. First off is I do think it was slightly too high priced relative to some of what it was being compared to. When it was compared to the lower price stuff, that was newer and had an automatic transmission and had available power steering. And this car never got either of those. It got a 5-speed, base 4-speed, but it never had an automatic option. And I do believe that in spite of the interior materials, I think compare more than favorably with what like the Excel or the Yugo had, it didn't have an automatic. And it just fell behind. And I think people would have looked at this car and said, okay, so Civic this, but it's really competing down here. It's just, I think it ended up very awkwardly placed in the market. And I vividly remember one of their commercials, their car commercials, having like a Volkswagen Beetle drive through the forest, it's a legend, and here comes the fox, right? And driving through the forest. And this should have been a hit. And in most ways, in the chassis, in the handling, in the gas mileage, in the feel, they said it's one of their top choices. It could have been such a hit, but it looks like they just cheapened out or didn't have options in a few things that could have pushed it over the top. Regardless, I had one, and I want to end with a quick story of how Volkswagen treated me. Because before this car, I was against imports, not just Japanese imports. I was against imported cars. But I had friends who had Volkswagens, and they were like, you need to drive Volkswagen. I couldn't afford a Golf or a Jetta, and I discovered the Fox, and I'm like, hey, I want to buy one. So I bought one, and actually it was cool. I went to drive it, and I decided not to buy it. And the week after I drove it the first time, the air conditioner broke. And I went back to talk to them, and they're like, look, we're going to give you X number of dollars off because we're not going to fix it. And I got a deal. I drove that car for years. And yeah, the hydraulic struts on the hatch didn't work. But that thing transported me back and forth 2 hours and 45 minutes on the interstate each way every weekend for years because it could hold everything. And it would cruise at a really nice high speed. And it got great gas mileage. I loved this car. When I graduated, I got married. We went on our honeymoon, and on the way to the honeymoon, Boiling hot water pours out onto the floorboard. For the most part, we spent our honeymoon in the service station of a Volkswagen dealer because the heat exchanger had broken. And so my opinion of import cars and how different they felt in terms of around city and especially on the highway at speed, this car transformed my opinion of Volkswagen. And so here I am. I have no job. I've graduated. I'm married. I'm on my honeymoon. We're in the dealership. It was like $700, something like that. And we went home and I started my first job and I wrote a letter to Volkswagen of America. And I said, here's the situation. I love my Fox, but this just happened. And here's a copy of the receipt. They sent me a check for it. Now, it does turn out that it was a recall item. I did not know, but they sent me a check for it. And to this day, I think that they looked at a human being, looked at it and went, man, we need to help this guy. I believe that in my heart. Do I believe Volkswagen is the same company today? No. Do they make affordable cars like this? Not really. But I have a really high opinion of it. Thanks for listening to this reminisce and these very solidly attached rose-colored glasses of one of the cheapest Volkswagens ever made, where the buttons could fall off. And I loved everything about it. Thanks for being here, guys.